Thank you all for having me. Thank you all for actually showing up and not staying in bed, because I know you were tempted, don't lie. I'm going to be talking today about cognitive enhancement, but I'm coming at this obviously from a really different perspective. And my perspective is of a substance use researcher. So Sebastian noted, so I have my bachelor's degree in neuroscience, my PhD's in clinical psychology, and guess what I do? I do substance use epidemiology. I don't do any of that stuff. I figured out patients weren't my thing. I needed to do research and teaching. So my perspective is going to be similar to some of the shorter talks that you've heard, but definitely different than the philosophical ethical angles, which I have found very interesting, but is like halfway between English and German as far as what I can understand. Some of it was a little tough for me. My area of research is in prescription drug misuse. So I'm going to concentrate more heavily on prescription stimulants than on non-pharmacological treatments. Dr. Chanel did a great job of outlining a lot of those. I'm going to talk about them briefly. It's not super duper my area of expertise, so I don't want to go too far, but I am going to bring up some studies on those sorts of things. So what I'm going to be doing, there we go. Cool, I'm good. If I can figure out how the pointer works, maybe I didn't do it right. Early for me too. Is this one? There we go. I got it. No, we're good. Okay, so I don't necessarily need the microphone. I can talk about. Most of what I'm going to be talking about, as I said, is pharmacological cognitive enhancement. So I'm going to talk about different forms of amphetamines, dextroamphetamine, mixed amphetamine salts, methylphenidate. We'll talk also about modafinil and caffeine. I'm not going to talk a lot about other drugs. So we heard about guanfacine, which is a non-stimulant medication for the treatment of ADHD. Part of the reason I'm not going to talk about it is, as we heard, there's not a lot to say necessarily. It's a maybe. It's something to study. It's interesting, but there's not a lot out there. I'm talking about these four primarily because they're pretty well studied and they're pretty well characterized. And I like to do this, and so this does not mean you can tune out, but I'm going to go ahead and cut to the end now so you hear the message multiple times, which is that I don't think this stuff works very well. Okay, that's the message I'm going to convey to you. So now I'm going to spend the rest of my time supporting that premise. Okay, so before I do that, though, I do want to talk about who does these things and how often people engage in pharmacological cognitive enhancement. So this is a more recent study from 2024, Tully and colleagues, looking at university students and staff in the UK and their past year use of cognitive enhancement pharmacological interventions. So you start over on your left looking at stimulant drugs, progress to illicit stimulants, cocaine, methamphetamine, microdosing. I want to briefly talk about that, but I'm not going to talk about that a ton either. And then alcohol and cannabis. So I think this slide highlights a lot of things. Number one, there is not a standard group of drugs or medications that we talk about when we talk about cognitive enhancement. Because I don't know about you, but I don't think alcohol is a particularly effective cognitive enhancer. If the enhancement you're going for is saying stranger things or being a little less inhibited, perhaps it's great. But if you are trying to focus or concentrate, be more intelligent, if you are, to think about students trying to produce a thoughtful term paper, alcohol will not help you. Neither particularly will cannabis. Maybe we could make a case more for cannabis, but I am not going to do that. We heard about microdosing, and this is the other message I want to convey here, which is that something that the literature does not do well, and I think will need to do better, is to tie what the goals of cognitive enhancement are to the modality. Because if you are trying to concentrate and focus, a microdose of psilocybin probably isn't your avenue. If you are trying to be more thoughtful and creative, if you are trying to gain insights into a task you're trying to complete, life goals, maybe I'm not going to enhance microdosing. I'm relatively skeptical of its utility. It's very hot in the United States, and the evidence is not so hot. And the evidence that is out there, by the way, has some real conflict of interest issues that are very fun to think about and problematic as well. Illegal stimulants, please don't do that. Okay, modafinil, amphetamine, and methylphenidate are the most commonly thought of, most accepted cognitive enhancers. And you'll see the one that's not up here is caffeine, because it would break scale. Past year use would be 90% higher. So we are talking about past year use. So what's the problem here? I'm trying to present this as a thought about cognitive enhancement in the UK. What's an issue here? Does anybody see this? What's an issue here? With the study, with the prevalence, with the sample, with any of it? Trying to keep you. It's not going.
Well, it's past year use, so it could be just once.
Okay, so first things first, very important point. This is why in my research, I hate lifetime use, because that's meaningless. That could have happened 20 years ago, depending on your age. Could have happened 30 or 40. And past year use, as Dr. Racine points out, could be once 9, 10, 11 months ago. It also could be 13 months ago and you just think it's 12 months ago. So that's the problem as well. Okay, so number one, this and the other research evidence kind of tells us cognitive enhancement is not a thing that most people do frequently. First of all, if we're looking at amphetamine, methylphenidate, modafinil, we're talking about 1 in 8 people maybe. But who are these people? That's the other issue. This isn't the general population. This is university staff and university students. And folks, we're not normal. Don't tell yourself you are. We're a unique population. Okay? So that tells us something. The other thing I want to point out then comes from here. So this is work I did a few years ago looking at trends in prescription stimulant misuse. This is general population, but you see it's broken down by age. Okay. Number one, this is just amphetamine, methylphenidate, modafinil combined. So it's not all the other stuff. But if you remember, we were talking about 1 in 8, 1 in 7 people in the UK in the past year. This is also past year. And the rates are much lower, even in young adults. So number one, university students and university staff are not the general population. Number two, the United States and the UK, and I think the UK and the European Union are closer on this, are at different points in this process. In my opinion, prescription stimulant interest in the United States has already peaked. It's going down. There's actually more recent evidence that would show this going further down. And on the last slide, you saw that pre to post COVID, if you notice, I didn't highlight this, rates went up slightly. In the United States, they have fallen a lot. And there's a lot of potential reasons for that, at least in the United States, like lockdowns and disruptions and networks able to, people's ability to obtain these medications for misuse. But we've seen kind of changes there. So another thing to keep in mind is there is not one picture in the developed world. It's very different depending on where you are. Okay, so let's talk about the individual drugs. I'm going to start with amphetamine because it's my least favorite. Does amphetamine help as a cognitive enhancer? And my answer is, it depends. But my larger answer is not really. So this is a study from the United States. So the SAT, if you don't know, and if you don't know, good, it's awful, is a pre-university entrance exam, basically. That tells you, it's intended to tell you college readiness. There's a lot of issues with the SAT, obviously, as there are with all of these sorts of exams. So there are math questions that are intended to be typically known and understood by your first year university student. Same for verbal. Those kinds of questions are things like analogies. They'll give you an example analogy. You get a word and then you have to complete an analogy in the similar way. Antonyms, opposites of words. It's vocabulary, reading comprehension. It's awful. I don't miss it. what you see here is that when participants were given a placebo, when they were given amphetamine, performance doesn't really differ from baseline. Now, this is a complicated task. What does this involve? Well, it involves a pre-existing level of knowledge that amphetamine doesn't give you. It's facilitating memory recall, but kind of longer term memory recall. So if somebody doesn't have the background knowledge, it doesn't matter. We all know amphetamine isn't going to give you that. But the point of this is that, again, you've got to tie the cognitive enhancer to the goal you're trying to achieve. And at least in this case, it's not going to magically teach you what words mean or how to do basic algebra. That's not what happens here. But, and we all know this if we deal in this field, people will tell you that amphetamine is very effective. Why is it effective? And what does it do? So I'm going to do 2 slides on this. This first one, over on the left, has a task called the CPT-3. It is basically an extremely boring response task where you hit the space bar if an X shows up and you inhibit the response otherwise. So you are predisposed to inhibit the response because the vast majority of letters are not X's. But your job is to respond as quickly as possible when the X shows up. So if you want to have more consistent performance on a relatively long, 13 minutes, and boring task, maybe amphetamine can help a little. If you, however, want to do a working memory task, which I would suggest for most of us is more valuable and more important, amphetamine will make your performance worse. It also does a great job of making you have a higher heart rate, higher blood pressure. You feel amphetamine. Amphetamine is probably the strongest of these 3 that I will talk about. I'm not excluding caffeine. So you know you're on the drug. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that amphetamine has heavy expectancy effects, that you think something is going to happen, so you tell me something is happening, and that it's also extremely hard to give someone a placebo for amphetamine. You just can't, as a substance use researcher, you can't placebo substance use typically. If you try and do a placebo with alcohol, guess what? People pretty quickly figure out it's not alcohol. Even if you do it very well, the typical paradigm on that is you give people orange juice. One has a standard dose of something like vodka in it. The other just has a tiny bit splashed on the top. So you smell it, it seems like it's alcohol, but people figure it out quickly. They figure this out quickly too. So they know if they're on the drug or not. And again, in this case, they tell you that they feel it rather strongly. Okay, so methylphenidate, number 2. Methylphenidate, a little more promising. This is from a meta-analysis, Roberts and colleagues, where they looked at a number of different domains. So recall, you'll notice there are a lot of different tasks up here. So this is just a memory task. Sometimes it's immediate recall. Maybe you get a word list, and immediately after reading it, you have to tell the tester how many words you remember, and you tell them the words. Sometimes it's pictures, sometimes it's verbal, sometimes it's delayed. That's a pretty common paradigm. I'll give you a word list. We go through it a few times. You come back tomorrow. What words do you remember? Sometimes delays can just be 5 minutes. And in this meta-analysis, is this pointer? Nice. So you see this overall effect is significant, but it's a small effect size. And there's a lot of, as you can look up here and see, heterogeneity in the effects. In other words, we're talking about a set of studies that don't necessarily point in a consistent direction. And that's partially because we're looking at a lot of different things. The same is true for sustained attention, where I would suggest that these drugs are better at doing something. If you need to maintain attention to a relatively boring task, well, it does an okay job. Again, smaller effect size, but something. I'm going to show you one more domain in a second, but because this was on the figure, the overall effect is very small. So a 0.2 for an effect size, if you don't know effect sizes, is a small effect size. It means something's happening, but not a whole lot. So overall on cognition, methylphenidate does do things, just not a ton. It does it for recall. It does it for, oh, I had my finger in front of that, sustained attention, and for inhibitory control. Again, that might be an aspect of sustained attention. It can be a little hard to tease those apart. But you've got a small effect size, though very close to non-significant. Okay, so this was 2.1.1. You may not remember, but we got up to like 2.1.8, 10. So what am I not showing you? All of the other domains that are not significant, where methylphenidate doesn't do anything. Because in the majority of cognition, it doesn't do anything. So even methylphenidate, so amphetamine, don't do amphetamine. Methylphenidate, where there is better evidence, is still more limited. The same is true for modafinil. A great example of a cultural difference is in modafinil. Modafinil is not a thing in the United States. It's just not. I don't know. You just don't. In university students, you don't hear it. It's just not a thing. It is in Europe, but it's not in the United States. The thing to always remember, you'll probably remember this and nothing else I say, by the way, but that's fine. Drug use is heavily about availability. I teach a class on psychopathology when I teach. And one way I illustrate substance use and substance use problems is this. If you get marooned on a desert island, now, good news, you have electricity somehow, you have an infinite supply of food, maybe you have a nice stereo so you can have your 5 albums on your desert island thing or whatever. You have stuff to do. I can't promise you that you won't get anxious. You probably will. I can't promise you you won't get depressed. You probably will. I can promise you you will not have a stimulant use disorder because you're not going to be able to manufacture methamphetamine or cocaine. I can promise you that. You won't have one. Won't happen. So access matters. And in the United States, modafinil is just not available. It's not a drug that's used commonly. It's very restricted to sleep disorders, and a very small proportion of the population has narcolepsy, for instance. Whereas for ADHD, methylphenidate and amphetamines, they're all over the place. For modafinil, there is a small overall effect, but again, it's limited to very specific domains. This study over here, you'll see blue and red lines. This was a study of folks who had schizophrenia and who did not. The blue lines are folks who don't, your control population, if you will. And the only significant result was for social cognition in the folks who don't have schizophrenia. So again, we're talking about a very limited set or area of cognition that's benefited by a pharmaceutical intervention. Caffeine. So caffeine is different. Why is caffeine different? There's 2 reasons caffeine's different. Come on, think about it. Why is caffeine different? Okay, so first of all, it is not a, I'm going to use US terminology, it is not a controlled medication. You don't have to go to a physician and prove you have ADHD or narcolepsy to get caffeine. You have to go downstairs and put 70 cents or euros or whatever you guys say into the machine, get some coffee, you're good to go. Okay. I saw people getting on the plane when I flew over here with their Monster or their whatever. I think those things are real. Okay. So it's easy to get, legal, and it's available. It also doesn't seem to carry the same risk. The worst case scenario is, for most people, that you go into withdrawal if your caffeine access is restricted. That's not fun. If you've ever had caffeine withdrawal, it's unpleasant, but it's also not the same thing as a stimulant overdose. Those are very different propositions. So caffeine Also probably doesn't do a ton. But the thing we always have to think about here is the benefits versus the risks. Don't forget the risks. And the risks of amphetamine use when it's not prescribed to you, the risks of methylphenidate use when it's not prescribed to you are considerable. There are real risks. When it's prescribed, it's safe. I'm going to kind of sidestep that for a second. So caffeine intentional enhancement, which you would expect is something that would benefit, maybe, maybe not. But some increases in processing speed, positive effects on short and long-term memory. Now, the second big bullet point is something I want to highlight. And again, this ties into the larger issue of you need to tie the cognitive enhancement to the goal you have. And one clear question is, are we talking about enhancing normal cognition or impaired cognition? Impairments in cognition can be from a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, from ADHD, from a sleep disorder that impairs normal sleep. But it also can be in a few of us in the audience who are a little sleep deprived right now. And caffeine does seem to help with that. There's some evidence that some of these drugs can potentially help with jet lag, which some of us are also still experiencing. So you need to be very attentive to what you're trying to do. My case is basically that normal cognition doesn't benefit a lot from these drugs, but impaired cognition might. And when we think about, this is a point I would urge the group to consider for the larger paper, and it's talked about with the ethics. I've heard this in the ethics talks. Is there a difference between enhancing normal cognition and remediating, improving deficits in cognition? I think there is. I think most of us think that, but that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so a few direct comparisons. This is for day after 24-hour memory recall for words. And we only see a little bit for methylphenidate in this box plot. So there is a significant difference between placebo and methylphenidate, but not between any of the others. And this difference is small. So again, limited effects and limited specific effects that probably aren't worth regular dosing. Do you want to take methylphenidate every time you're trying to memorize something? That would be a lot of methylphenidate. I loved this study, not because I play chess, I just thought it was really an interesting paradigm. This is a study of timed chess. So many folks, when they play competitive chess, play timed. Can't get to play forever. And what you see is that for the stimulants, caffeine, methylphenidate, and modafinil, that performance early in the match is better. This is basically survival here is just not losing. So early on, the odds of losing are lower if you take a stimulant, but once you get time stressed, it doesn't matter. It doesn't help. Something that seems to be consistent, and it shows up here too, is that stimulants may help with quicker responding, but not necessarily with better responding. And that's what you see here. The knapsack task is an executive functioning task that asks you to arrange items in a hypothetical knapsack. Okay? And you do a number of moves, and what you see is that placebo in the blue, the quality of each move is much better for placebo. But the number of moves, this top line here, is faster on a stimulant. This should not be a surprise. Stimulants speed people up. But the trade-off is that performance is poorer. Are there tasks where that's okay? If so, maybe a stimulant would be helpful. If not, we've got a problem. I want to tie this back together by a study. This was someone at the University of Maryland, Amelia Arya, who's a very well-known substance use researcher, did a lot of work on stimulants, has kind of moved in a different direction. But I love this study. Because ultimately, why do universities, sorry, I'm using American words. Why do university students use and misuse stimulant drugs? Well, at least from a cognitive enhancement profile, isn't it to improve their grades? Isn't it improve their marks, better performance? Like, what else would you do it for? You could do it to drink more. People do that. You could do it to get high, but none of those are cognitive enhancement. We're talking about cognitive enhancement. So, does it actually help? The answer is, you already know the answer. You can see this. The answer is no. In folks who never, this is between year 2 to year 3, grade point average is just your average marks over your college, over your university career. I keep using Americanism. Sorry, I'm trying my best. Over your college career, from year 2 to year 3, how does it change? Well, if you never engage in prescription stimulant misuse, your marks get slightly but significantly better. This is on a 4-point scale, just to give you an idea. So it's not a major change, but it is a real change. All of the rest of these are non-significant, but you'll notice the folks who engage in prescription stimulant misuse are pointed in the wrong direction. That's not good. Cognition is really complicated, and the outcomes we measure are not easily tied to discrete aspects of cognition. Performance at university isn't just about attention. It isn't just about recall. It's about a lot of aspects of cognition. And if these drugs don't enhance them all, what's the point? So there's downsides too. And the downsides are pretty numerous. I've just shown you a small picture of the downsides. But in university students engaged in prescription stimulant misuse, they have much higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. They have higher rates of anxiety and more severe anxiety. They have much higher rates of other substance use and heavy substance use. We were talking last night. We were talking about opioids and benzodiazepines, slightly different. But one of the strongest correlates of prescription opioid misuse is prescription benzodiazepine misuse, and vice versa. People who misuse one drug tend to misuse others too, at least more than the average person does. So there are lots of risks. Now, I'm going to wake you back up again. What's the problem with this sort of thing? It's not causal at all, although there is causal evidence. There is better causal evidence. I'm not going to be the causality police, but there's better, more causal evidence. There's not causal evidence because we don't have enough people today. But the point is, Suzanne's trying to make, I think, larger, is this is a self-selected group. People who engage in prescription drug misuse are different than people who don't. And they have a lot of underlying characteristics that may make them different. And one we actually heard about already, or maybe we'll hear about it today. My memory is starting to fail me. And that is that people who misuse prescription stimulants do have, or say they have, higher or more severe ADHD symptoms. Now, do they? I don't know. This is self-reported. I don't necessarily believe them, but they say that. They believe they're self-treating ADHD. And I have a study that shows this too. Other people have done this work. So it's complicated. But the case I'm going to make is that basically prescription stimulant misuse isn't worth the trade-off. Would it be worth the trade-off if we were regulating this and doing this in the general population? My stance is still no. But that's a different question to a degree. And we've got problems of self-selecting populations and things like that. Okay, so quickly, I've said all of this. I want to highlight these key questions, though. I'm going to skip through most of this. So number one, there are strong expectancy effects for all of these. In other words, if you think you're getting a stimulant, you start to physiologically act like you've gotten one. If we give you decaffeinated coffee in one trial and tell you it's caffeinated, you will act like it's caffeinated. Like physiologically, you will act like it's caffeinated. The brain is extremely powerful. So if you believe you've gotten the drug, you will act like you have gotten the drug. And that's the other problem with a placebo. You can't typically hide these drugs. And the others I've talked about generally, so I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Okay, so quickly, I'm going to talk about non-pharmacological interventions, and these are non-invasive interventions. Again, Dr. Chanel talked about these much more. She's the expert. Bug her after the talk. Don't bug me. I don't know the answer to some of this. Okay, so we have electrical stimulation, transcranial alternating current, direct current stimulation, and we also have transcranial magnetic stimulation. So unlike, and you know this, prescription drugs, which are out in the environment, you don't see a lot of people doing this out and about. In the case of transcranial magnetic stimulation, it's a pretty big setup. It's not something you can just kind of carry around. You can buy setups for these sorts of things, but I think we all also know taking it from the lab to the real world is a very different thing. So alternating current stimulation, this is a meta-analysis with a forest plot. So the overall effect on working memory is a positive one. So you put on the electrodes, take a short, all of these had very different methodologies, obviously. Do some electrical stimulation. Your working memory is improved, and it's improved at a relatively moderate effect size. That's nice. That's positive. That's interesting. Now, important to point out, you can see a lot of variability in the studies. Even with, there's a study over here where the mean value is off the chart. But this study, something I liked about it a lot was when they removed outliers, and the outliers here are generally very positive outliers, they still found a significant effect. So even if some of these studies aren't methodologically great, there may be something going on with electrical stimulation and working memory. And working memory is a nice thing to enhance. If you don't know what working memory is, it's basically very short-term, immediate sorts of memory. If you need to remember a telephone number, you're using working memory. When someone tells you the phone number and then you need to type it in and call it, that's working memory. It's short-term, it's used to hold things for a little bit, and then you usually let it go. Another important thing to remember is, again, are we looking at unimpaired cognition, impaired cognition, or in this case, a different subgroup? Older adults are not necessarily impaired. Many of them are, but many of them are not. And in the case of, again, electrical stimulation, this is a paired nonsense word picture task. So they show you a picture you would know, something like an apple, let's say. But they make up a word for it that you would not know. And you have to pair the two and learn that. In younger adults, 22 years of age, no benefit of the stimulation. In older adults, 66 years of age, the stimulation was significantly beneficial. So again, think about not just the general population, but impaired versus non-impaired, different age effects, and different effects in terms of sex, which we'll get to in a second. So this is direct current stimulation. Again, broadly electrical stimulation, slightly different paradigm, but electrical stimulation. And there's overall a moderate effect size on cognition. It's better at motor improvements than cognitive ones. And I don't quite know how they did this or what this means, but I'm going to put it up here. The meta-analysis, they did sort of a counterfactual of how many non-significant results would they need for direct current stimulation to no longer be significantly effective. And they said it was 442 studies. That sounds like a really large number. It sounds kind of absurdly large. But the point is, it seems to be a real effect. This isn't something where they're cherry picking the best studies, or something those of us who work in like biological or psychological sorts of sciences know, the file drawer effect, where non-significant studies don't get published. That's what they're trying to account for here a little bit, and they seem to have done so. Okay, magnetic stimulation, I'm going to do quickly because the evidence is not so good. For transcranial magnetic stimulation and cognition, a review suggested that whether it's high frequency or low frequency magnetic waves, there's not a big effect. But again, older adults with cognitive impairments may benefit. A really important area for these non-pharmacological interventions is to figure out who is the population of interest, who might benefit and who might not. Because for most interventions, one group benefits more than the other. We've known this for a long time. An example is detecting, this is prevention, not treatment, but detecting heart attacks. Women have different symptoms than men do. But most of the research for decades was on men, and women weren't getting identified. And it was a problem that wasn't discovered until more recently. We need to understand differences between groups as well. This is intermittent theta burst stimulation, so it's also kind of a magnetic stimulation. There is maybe a small effect, but I want to outline that as opposed to the first study for direct current stimulation, where they removed outliers and those outliers probably made things look better, in this case, they had to remove outliers to get a significant effect. I would always be very skeptical of that. You can decide what's an outlier and what's not an outlier based on you wanting to get a paper published. I'm not saying they did that here. I'm also not saying they didn't do that here. I don't know. I would be very skeptical. Okay. I'm only going to outline these very briefly because what we're going from is very well known, very well understood, very widely used pharmacological interventions to better known, still developing the evidence base for non-invasive stimulation to, boy, this is pretty experimental stuff here. So there is vagal nerve stimulation. That is a cranial nerve that goes between the heart and the brain, stem. Deep brain stimulation, brain-computer interfaces. I'm going to very, very quickly touch on those. Others have talked about those. Boy, am I out of my area of expertise now. But vagal nerve stimulation is actually a well-known treatment for treatment-resistant depression. People who get it have a pacemaker implanted with electrodes that lead to the vagal nerve that send regular signals, and it's very effective when other things don't work. Obviously, this is not the first choice treatment. We try 6 antidepressants before we do this. Might even try electroconvulsive therapy before we try this. That's a very well-known, very well-characterized, very safe treatment done as well. Very effective. Vagal nerve stimulation may help memory enhancement, but there is some evidence potentially of sex differences. Now, this is kind of something they're proposing more than necessarily know, but they propose that men may benefit more than women, but it's not clear. They have some more theoretical reasons for that and less evidence necessarily, but it's a great example of something to study. Given that vagal nerve stimulation helps with depression, it shouldn't be surprising that it also helps with emotional learning and emotional processing, which are different aspects of cognition. So this may not be a great treatment for everyone, but it might be a great treatment for people whose post-traumatic stress disorder has a very heavy memory kind of component to it. And it doesn't have to be invasive. I talked about it as being invasive, but you can do it transcutaneously. You can do it on the outside of the skin and send the signals to the vagal nerve that way. So it doesn't have to be invasive. This is the invasive version, and there's the vagal nerve. Deep brain stimulation. This was talked about already, so I'm not going to talk about it much. But this is primarily, I believe it was Dr. Chanel who said this, done in people who have very severe epilepsy that is not treated with medication. This is done in people who are otherwise typically getting some form of brain surgery. We don't want to do this very invasive procedure in everyone, but there is evidence that it can help with cognitive control, flexibility, attention. But this is very early on, and I don't know about you. I would like to be better at these things, but not at the expense of them getting into my brain in a surgical suite. I'll pass. Brain-computer interfaces. We're really early in this. It's very interesting stuff. And again, the question is, are we going to work with people who are amputees, where we're trying to help them work with a new prosthetic limb? Or are we trying to help people who are otherwise normal? There's a real interest in both. But my closing thought for this is not, because I'm not going to talk about it a lot, is that there is a lot of interest in this, as you all well know, from venture capital, Neuralink kind of stuff, from the military, and I'm thinking particularly of the United States military, and you can have your own opinions about the United States military. I'm an American and I don't totally trust them. This is being broadcast, right? Great. I shouldn't have said that. You know what? The National Security Agency already knows I feel that way. Not the CIA. The CIA knows you feel that way. The CIA is outside the country. It's a big difference. I think academia needs a very big role in this, both academic researchers, but also academic ethicists. If we don't get at the table, this is going to proceed as Elon Musk wants it to proceed. And I'm about to find out as an American how Elon Musk wants some things to proceed. And let me tell you what, I will also say this on tape. I'm very worried about that. So this is an important area for us to insert ourselves because we have important things to say. We have experience with research. We have experience with research done ethically. And we know the mistakes that academic research has made in the past. We know that academic research, and I am thinking of the United States here, has taken advantage of people who could not stand up for themselves or did not know to stand up for themselves. And we need to avoid that here. While, if these techniques are effective, making them available to everyone. It's a tough balance, but it's something we need to think about. Okay, I've talked about most of this. I'm going to very quickly just wrap up by talking about some limitations of the literature, some questions. A key one that we noted for pharmaceuticals is inconsistency in measures in populations. Again, people who engage in prescription misuse self-select. They engage in that behavior, and they're probably different because they're willing to do that. So the research we see in those people may not apply to the general population who would be more skeptical of misuse, of self-treatment. Again, techniques that work well in the lab often work poorly when taken out of the lab. We've got to be aware of that and ready to deal with that. Again, for pharmaceuticals primarily, but I do think this can also apply to non-invasive techniques. It is hard to have an effective placebo. People know if they're getting the treatment or not. And how do you account for that? I'm actually going to I'm going to mainly concentrate, I think, on two of these because I've already talked about others. I'm going to concentrate on number 1 and number 3. Number 1, Dr. Chanel noted this. We don't know the long-term effects of transcranial electrical stimulation, of transcranial magnetic stimulation. We don't know. We know the long-term effects of stimulant medication if used properly. You'd probably be a little shorter and smaller than you would be otherwise, but you may catch up. That's actually a little controversial. You may have some sleep problems, but if you have ADHD, if you know someone who has ADHD, I wholeheartedly endorse using these medications. as prescribed appropriately, they're helpful. But we don't know the long-term effects of some of these interventions. And certainly the more experimental, the newer ones, we really don't know. And then number three, there's a real question of whether enhancement is zero sum. In other words, I'll go back to pharmaceuticals. You respond more quickly, that's improved, but less accurately and less effectively. That's worse. Is cognitive enhancement zero sum? And that's a real question that people have raised about this kind of stuff. I don't have the answer to that. That's a question. But that's something you have to think about. If so, that doesn't mean cognitive enhancement is bad or ineffective. It just means you need to target that form of enhancement for a task where the benefits are good and the trade-offs, the losses, aren't a problem. And those things exist. You just need to know what they are. And I think that's a big challenge for this field is, again, tying the benefits to actual tasks that people need to complete or get better at. All right, with that, I will stop. Thanks to many amazing colleagues. They're not watching. It's what time is it? It is really early in the morning in the United States. Everyone's asleep. But I will say that I really do appreciate the National Institutes of Health and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for giving me money. I like money. So I appreciate their support of my work. And with that, I will take any questions that you have.